Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the third edition of the Energy and Resources Forum. It's lovely to have you here. May I ask the audience, anyone who has not been here this morning? Yeah? A bunch of new people? Okay. So I'll just say it again. We're going to have speakers, we're going to hear and see them present, but we're also going to have discussions, we're going to have a panel with them, and the idea is that you get to discuss with us. I've got this lovely cube here, there's a microphone hidden in it, and I will toss it into the audience. It's not going to break, and it will not kill anyone if it hits anyone, so to make sure. But there's one thing I was told: when you speak, make sure you take it close so everybody can hear. One has the tendency to just keep it further away. It gets more difficult to understand. So that's for the cube, but it's not just yet. We're going to get into the topic. I hope you had a lovely lunch and you're full of new energy to get started on the afternoon. We were talking fairly broadly, discussing fairly broadly this morning, and we asked, can we power the world with 100% renewables? So if you think about that, it is clear you need new technologies, you need the grids, you need the people, you need a lot of things. Now we're going to focus. You don't just need the technologies, you need the resources and the materials to build those technologies. And that's going to be the next panel. We're going to talk about copper, cobalt, lithium, whatever it takes to build solar panels or batteries. And we're going to see what the state of all of that is. So, it is a great pleasure to I think I don't get you in front together, one after the other. I've got three speakers, three guests. They will each do a little intro, and then we're going to discuss with them. And I do have the pleasure to introduce to you someone who comes from beyond Swiss borders. She studied at EPFL, that she did. She studied physics, but she works internationally today. She works for the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and the IEA used to be formally about oil and gas. Today, it is all about energy security, efficiency, and renewables. The IEA produces reports. The 2050 report, for instance, motivated a lot of different countries to get going on their zero emission plans. And my guest, she contributed to over 40 flagship reports that have formed the global narrative on clean energy transitions, or actually just the one that's ahead of us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me Amrita Dasgupta.
So, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I already received a really lovely introduction, so today I'll just be presenting some global perspectives on the critical minerals needed for energy transitions based on all the work and the analysis that we do at the International Energy Agency in Paris. So clean energy transitions have been happening at a pace that is much faster than what was expected. In 2023 alone, global annual renewable capacity additions increased by more than 50%, which was the fastest growth rate in the past 2 decades. This was led by solar PV, which was estimated to have increased by 85% year on year, closely followed by wind, which increased about 60%. The sale of electric cars also increased year on year by 35%, but this was a slightly slower rate than what we saw between 2021 and 2022. And this really shows the need for continued and consistent policy support on all clean energy technologies. So we expect that the momentum in all these areas will continue through 2024 and much beyond, with solar PV and wind capacity additions being the majority of all power capacity additions between today and 2050, and about 40 million new EVs being sold in the year 2030 already. So with about 80% of today's GDP and emissions being covered by net zero pledges from countries around the world, the world will need a lot more electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, electricity transmission and distribution lines. And many of the technologies that we will need for this clean energy future will require significantly more mineral resources than their fossil fuel-based counterparts that we traditionally used until now. For example, a typical electric car requires about 6 times more mineral inputs than a conventional car, and an offshore wind plant requires 13 times more mineral resources than a similarly sized gas-fired power plant. And this really means that the traditional definition of energy security will need an update. So this rising deployment of EVs and renewables is driving substantial rise in mineral demand, with the demand for lithium already tripling between just 2017 and 2022. On the other hand, nickel and cobalt demand also increased by about 40 and 70% respectively. Compared to other metals and minerals, this has been a huge growth, and the share of demand coming from clean energy technologies has been steadily growing, as you can see here. We've also seen a doubling of the market size of key energy transition minerals over the past 5 years. And these minerals used to be a small segment of the market, but they're now moving into center stage. As you can see, there has been a very large increase of battery minerals compared to copper, for example, which is used, of course, in clean energy technologies, but for many other applications. However, in 2021 and early 2022, many of these critical minerals that we need for the energy transitions experienced broad-based price increases with really strong volatility due to several geopolitical factors, particularly for lithium and nickel, which highlighted really the importance of mineral and material prices and the costs of transforming our energy system. Although prices for some, or rather many of these critical minerals have once again fallen, there is still an ongoing concern that such price volatility in the long term can really impact the speed and the affordability of our energy transition, which is a risk that we really can't afford to take. The IEA has 3 scenarios that underpin most of its modeling and analysis. We have the stated policy scenario, or the STEPS, which maps out a trajectory that reflects current policy settings. Then we have the announced pledges scenario, or the APS, which assumes that all long-term emissions and energy access targets will be met in full and on time, even if there aren't specific policies in place to achieve this yet. And finally, we have the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, or the NZE scenario, which sets out the pathway to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by end of the century. So in the NZE scenario, we see the rapid deployment of clean energy technologies implies the significant increases in critical minerals demand that you can see here. While EVs and battery storage are the main drivers of demand growth, there's also major contributions from low emissions power generation as well as electricity networks. So all of this means that it's far from assured that the supply of these critical minerals in the long term will match the pace of growth that is needed to achieve global climate ambitions. So I'll quickly go into the details for the 3 main supply challenges that we at the IEA have identified. So first, the biggest question is, will the supply from announced mining and refining projects meet this rapidly growing demand for minerals? While we do see a host of newly announced projects, and in some cases the announced projects for mining does imply an anticipated supply that will approach the requirements in our APS. However, for all major critical minerals, the supply announcements still fall short of what is required to achieve net zero goals. There's also some concerns that today's low price environment, as we see it in 2024, particularly for nickel and lithium, may cause project delays and cost overruns for several projects. And finally, there's also a large mismatch between the pace of development across the supply chain. On the manufacturing front, the industry has witnessed a huge surge in announcements, for example, to build new battery gigafactories. And when all of those announced projects are summed up, we get close to what is needed for the NZE scenario. However, the expected pace of mineral supplies does not match those of manufacturing capacity additions. Now, for supply to match demand at the pace that is required for the energy transitions, there is obviously a need for investment into new projects, as well as increased exploration and exploration spending in new geographical locations in the world. Thanks once again to the high commodity prices in 2022, there was elevated cash flows and a lot of profitability in the mining industry that year, which led to an investment, overall investment rise of about 30%. And also similarly, the exploration spending went up by 20% in 2022, primarily driven by the record growth in lithium exploration and followed by copper and nickel. Then the second major challenge we see is on supply resilience. The geographical concentration of supply remains extremely high. For lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements, the world's top 3 producing nations control well over 3/4 of the global output. The DRC alone accounts for about 70% of global cobalt production, and China is responsible for around 60% of the global production of rare earth elements. And when it comes to processing and refining, the levels of concentration are even more notable, with China being the decisive player across several commodities. There are particular difficulties which can make it hard to diversify the refining and processing segment, as the industry has historically favored concentrated global hubs, which specialize in individual high-tech applications. And so, based on today's announced pipeline of projects, we see that the geographical concentration of both mining and refining remain relatively similar, even in 2030, compared to today's levels. And then the final supply challenge is that, can all of these minerals be sourced in a sustainable and responsible way? ESG issues are increasingly emerging as an important contributor to security of supply of these minerals, since poor performance for ESG can create legal barriers and discourage investments. And right now, we see really mixed progress towards sustainable and responsible mining. The IEA has assessed the ESG performance of about 20 major mining companies and found that companies are making headway in, for example, community investment and gender balance. However, the safety of the workforce and environmental indicators are definitely not improving at a satisfactory rate. So there needs to be serious and concerted and accelerated efforts to mitigate these ESG risks associated with the mineral supply chains, as these impacts, of course, have the social implications, but they will also lead to a slowing down of the energy transitions, which, as I already mentioned, but it doesn't hurt to highlight again, we cannot afford. So last September, the IEA successfully held its first ever international summit on critical minerals, and we had around 50 countries from continents across the world participating, where we had ministers and leaders from industry, investment, and civil society come together to discuss the effective courses of action on critical minerals to ensure rapid and secure energy transitions. On this slide, I've summarized the key takeaways from this summit that we held last September, and all these takeaways will feed into our future activities on minerals. I'll just do a quick deep dive into point 2 that you see on this slide, which is unlocking the power of technology and recycling. And this can be used as a bridge to narrow the gap between clean energy-related demand and the primary supply needed from mining by reducing slightly the demand for these critical minerals. For example, if we consider a case where there is a higher share of lithium iron phosphate and sodium ion chemistries compared to NMC chemistry that has been popular for the last decade or so, such a technology shift could decrease mineral demand requirements by nearly 25% by 2050, and with the highest reductions being seen in nickel and graphite. And similarly, also an increased deployment of HVDC grids can reduce mineral demand by about 10% by 2050. And on the other hand, behavior change can also play a major role. In the NZE scenario, we see that behavior changes, such as a reduced appetite for SUVs or larger vehicles, can result in the average battery size peaking already in this decade, and thereby reducing mineral demand by almost 20% in 2030. And finally, recycling can also bring triple benefits on energy supply, on security, as well as on emissions. An increased focus on recycling could allow for secondary supplies of these minerals to play a larger role, reducing the demand for primary supplies and allowing regions such as Europe, which have a higher deployment of clean energy technologies but limited resource endowments, to achieve a higher level of mineral security. For bulk materials such as steel and aluminium, recycling is already well established, but this is definitely not the case today for energy transition minerals such as lithium and nickel. In the NZE scenario, we see that secondary supply from recycling could reduce the need for primary supplies from mining by about 15 to 30% by 2040, which is the time period by which we will have the first fleet of clean energy technologies being retired and therefore providing the feedstock for such recycling to be scaled up. So with this, I would just like to thank you for your attention, and I have some conclusions here on this slide, and I would invite all of you to visit the IEA website, where you can find a host of our reports on several topics, but specifically on critical minerals, we have had several reports already, and we also do regional reports which delve into the aspect of critical minerals for each of these regions. For example, we have the Africa Energy Outlook, we have the Latin America Energy Outlook, both very important regions for critical minerals. And we also have the Critical Minerals Data Explorer and Policy Tracker that is available free of cost for you to delve into all our available resources there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amrita Dasgupta. And would you care to take a seat on the panel? We'll be getting back to you and more questions just now. And thank you so much for this overview. Our next speaker, he's a researcher in ecological economics, and his interest lies in the industry and in the way the use of those materials develops and also shifts. And I'm really thrilled to hear his inputs. A warm welcome to Vincent Moreau.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction and invitation. I'll try to complement what Amrita just said and what was also said this morning in material terms, basically. And this is not new to most of you, but essentially the transition in material terms means shifting from a flow of fossil fuel to a stock of material. And this is all the investments that we were talking about this morning. And it's a completely different system. So it requires a lot of investment because it's building a new system. On the supply side, it's increasing the share of renewables, and on the demand side, essentially increasing the share of electricity. And so my question is, can such a system be sustainable from a material standpoint? You might all have a different answer, but I could say yes, based on history, because before we extracted fossil fuel, our energy system was more or less sustainable. Maybe biomass was an exception. But the idea is, can we build such a renewable energy system based exclusively based on the resource, the material resources we have at hand? And I will do the same as Amrita just said and focus more on metals than on non-metallic minerals and other resources, because that's a sort of a constraint where most of the constraint is. And maybe go a bit back in the past, where you probably know copper is the metal that we've used for the longest, and we sometimes call it Dr. Copper, for the simple reason that if the price of copper goes up, the economy goes up. So it's a bit of an indicator of how well economic activities are performing. And so only recently we see all these high-tech and light metals being essentially aluminum. And I'm also showing this because we tend to differentiate between metals based on their availability or their processing capacity. What's interesting with copper is that it could be considered a rare metal. It's the ore concentration of copper in most mines, on average, is less than 1%. And it's only higher for about a handful of metals, including iron, manganese, and others. But copper is also a good indicator because it's at the concentration that we find most metal in commercial or industrial mines. And so if we look at the evolution of the production and consumption of copper over time, on this diagram you have the demand, which is the dotted line here, modeled so from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of this century, and the production of the different countries. There's many things we could say about this. Clearly, Chile represents today and will, for a long time, represent the bulk of the extraction of copper, about 30%. It's also interesting to see that, as Amrita said, the resources, or reserves, we sometimes say, reserves being the share of resources that can be extracted with current technology, economically usually, they're very much concentrated, just like oil and gas, essentially. And so if this scenario materializes, starting in 2050, we'll have to think of ways we can supply copper from other sources than raw extraction. And as Amrita said, copper is used broadly. The share of copper in the energy system is relatively small compared to the share of copper in the economy. And so with that in mind, let me come back to the energy system. And there are different ways to measure how much we need some of these metals, copper and others, in energy or renewable energy technologies. And there are different ways we can measure it. And here, and I might be raising more questions than providing answers, but as you saw in the previous presentation, we're measuring the intensity of metal use per megawatt hour. So per megawatt, sorry, so per capacity, installed capacity. And this is what you have on the right here, where we compare different electricity producing technologies, and with wind and solar, PV or concentrated solar power, on the right, where we have the tons of steel per megawatt installed. And so clearly, some of the fact that the uncertainty of the range is so large, essentially because we need to build more capacity because of the intermittency of the stochastic nature of renewables. My question is, can we also measure the intensity of materials, metals, based on energy, so production, and megawatt hours in this case? And there are reasons to, obviously, advantages and disadvantages to both, but there are reasons to think that if we imagine the ENSOE scenario with onshore and offshore wind in the north of Europe and then solar in the south, the chance of having a dull day in the south and a no wind day in the north are relatively low. So there's some complementarity between renewable energy sources that we could exploit and then measure the intensity, the material intensity or the metal intensity of renewable energy technologies based on energy and not capacity necessarily. And so what I did with a few colleagues was to look at different energy scenarios, and you have them at the top here, 3 of them are from the IEA, 1 from the ARENA. Some of them are fully renewable by 2050, others not quite. But comparing a range of different metals with a life cycle impact assessment method, some of you might be familiar. And this is just a relative score on a log scale of the copper concentration to represent what would be the most critical elements to think about. And you see that there's no big difference among the scenarios, although some of them range from 450 joules of global consumption per year, we're about at 600 today, to as low as 250. But there's not much difference in the 5 scenarios, simply because the share of these different metals over the total consumption of these metals, which was included here, is relatively small. And that's a big part of the transition, is how the energy system and the production of renewable energy technologies will have to compete with existing demand. And then we could list or go through most metals, but I'll leave this for the discussion maybe later. I just wanted to add one point, which is also interesting in terms of both the physical part of the energy of a future energy system, but also the economics of it. It's we haven't had much data so far, but now we do, on how much or how we're using some of these metals in alloy form. Steel is a mix of iron, nickel, and chrome, for example, in most cases. And so here you have the periodic table, obviously, with the elements in red that are mostly used in alloy form. This has at least two implications that I wanted to mention. First, it's to what extent we can substitute one metal for another. And second, obviously, how we will recycle them. And so you can see that, nickel, for example, here, chrome, titanium, which is also relatively abundant, and iron are mostly used in alloy form. And this has implications for recycling. And maybe one last thing to mention is that in OECD countries, there's about, as Amrita was saying, recycling of the main metals, aluminum, copper, and iron is well established. But it's also because the stock of these materials is relatively high, about 12 tons per capita, and with residence times that are relatively long. If we think of India, the stock of iron is about 2 tons per capita, so it needs to build up for a long time before we can reach a steady supply of secondary steel. And so maybe these are questions that we can mention later on. But just to summarize, and this goes same direction as was said before, the mix of renewables plays an important role on the raw material requirements for renewable energy systems. High-tech versus low-tech, we can think of large EVs versus small EVs. We can think of onshore versus offshore wind, and so on. And the fact that the energy system or the energy stakeholders, actors, will have to compete with other sectors who may have a larger ability to pay for these materials. And again, recycling may not play a big role at first. And one of the questions that I want to put up here is, should we use the remaining carbon budget we have to extract some of those materials? Because we know that there's no such thing as clean mining. As we saw, the impact indicators for mining are not improving at all. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Merci beaucoup, Vincent Moreau, and I'm asking you to take your seat on the panel so far, and we do have a third guest. He's the master of battery, I'd say. He is the head of the Swiss Battery Technology Center in Biel, and when we spoke on the phone before this event. He said, in my time, I've tried to electrify just about anything from the fire truck to the boat. And I may say, with him, we've also got a world champion here. He was the first one to successfully complete circumnavigation around the world on a solar boat. And I'm sure he's going to talk technology, but hopefully also a little bit about his adventure. Warm welcome, Christian Ochsenbein.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, we saw already quite scientific presentation before, so I tried to be not very scientific also for you to digest a bit the nice food that we had over lunch. Yes, so I'd like to start with that picture, with that tour that brought me around the world, only with the sun, right? So that was almost 18 months trip from Monaco to Monaco, so we crossed all the 7 seas. But I have only 10 minutes, so I don't tell you all the adventures, how to avoid pirates and things like that. I just want to do that to show you where the world was in 2010, 2012. And I speak mostly about the electric mobility because this is the main driver for batteries right now. And you can see here the statistics covers 10 years of the deployment, and it goes very much to what Amrita said before. Last year, more than 14 million EVs sold globally, but this was not always the case. So when we went around the world, electric mobility was nowhere, right? You see here 2014, we had the first Tesla Model S out there, the first BMW, Nissans, they were there, but the market share was close to zero. And this is when we talk here about S-curve adaptation for a transformation. And when you look closely, you see that every about 18, 20 months, something like that, the numbers of cars globally sold doubled, right? So for a very long time, actually nothing happened until you start to have a steep curve. And we have in the field of electric mobility policies that change and that leaves for one or the other countries not always to a steep rise, but still I'm believing that we see either a fast or actually even a faster adaptation of EVs. Some politicians, they don't believe that, and we will not kill the electric car anymore. Maybe we will kill the European industry, but not the electric car. And just like the first 10 days in March, 43% of all cars sold in China were EVs, so close to 50%. So you see where the tendency goes in the largest market for cars in the world. And I'm following now that trend since, Planet Solar, and I think we saw innovation which I thought were not possible. Like, for example, this car here from Zeekr. So you see where the innovation are coming from. They're not coming from BMW or Stellantis or Renault. They're coming from elsewhere, right? And this is a car that can drive maybe not 1,000 kilometers, but I would say something like 700-800 on a single charge are quite easily possible. Another thing is that we say electric cars are super expensive. Also, this is not longer true anymore. Another manufacturer from China, which claims that he can sell a car for about $11,000, and they start to ship it globally. So you see cars are also becoming affordable, even they are fully electric. And also what I find interesting, also the business models are changing quite fast. Here a legacy manufacturer which already decided from the 1st January 2023 onwards to no longer sell cars with combustion engine in Norway. Norway for you, they are now on more than 90% of all cars are electric vehicles. So they decided when it's on something like 50-60% that it makes no sense to invest in a dying technology anymore. and business models, I think, is together with policy at the end the main driver for this transformation. Amrita mentioned it before, we need tons of batteries if we want to do this transformation. Here is a map of how a future landscape in Europe could look like. It will certainly not come like that, but it gives you a glimpse on how many factories we have to build. I think the about 2,000 gigawatt hours that we need in Europe for an annual production, they could be reasonable to do a full transformation towards electric mobility and storage, and also decarbonization, transport of goods, and so on. It's very difficult to imagine what is a gigafactory, and I try to highlight that a bit in the next presentation. That's one of the newest factories in China from CATL. That's the world leader in battery production. And they have here a 30 gigawatt hour factory, which may well become a 60 gigawatt hour in the future. But you see only 30, and in Europe we need 2,000 gigawatt hours. And they claim that they produce every second a cell. I think this is somehow imaginable, but the whole battery pack, like 500 kilogram of materials, more or less, every 2.5 minutes. So you see how much minerals, materials this is, and I think this was a very nice presentation that we saw before from Vincent, that we are still in this kind of flow of material, but that we go to a stock, right? Because the battery at the end of the life of the car will still be there. For the last few slides, I would like to dig a bit deeper into the technology and show you what is actually in such a battery to make you understand what we can do actually to change and also to reduce stress out of this supply chain. So battery is very simple. It has a positive side and a negative side. You know all that when you changed here in the comment the batteries because they were old. That's the same for a car battery or for like every other battery. So in a battery you have two current collectors. When you take a standard lithium-ion batteries, this is usually on the anode side it's copper, and on the cathode side it's aluminium, and on those collectors you actually somehow glue the active material. The active material is the one making the batteries. With standard lithium-ion batteries you have mostly graphite on the anode, and then a mix of nickel, manganese and cobalt on the cathode side. So this is where what we saw in the presentation before, where these materials come from. Mostly anode and cathode side, and then you have lithium carbonate, which is then part which makes that this ion can flow between the two active materials in the middle, and you have organic materials in the middle, what you call electrolyte. So, and with this combination you can play, and then you have these different material compositions that you see here. This is a bit complicated, but what I want to show you can, for example, the cathode material, we had original 30, or 1/3 was nickel, 1/3 was manganese, 1/3 was cobalt, and it went to more and more nickel-rich cathode material. So now we start to have NMC 811, so it means 80% nickel and only 10% manganese and 10% cobalt. So you see cobalt has already massively reduced, and since a few years we see a massive comeback of something what is called lithium iron phosphate, here with the term LFP. I can show it here, and in this there is no cobalt, no nickel, no manganese at all anymore in the battery, and this is growing because it's just way cheaper, and we found ways on producing the batteries that have still a lot of mileage. And then there is something new. You see the market share here with the bullet point is close to 0, but that's sodium-ion batteries. And sodium-ion batteries, when you, depending how you do that, you don't need copper anymore, you don't need graphite anymore, you don't need lithium anymore. And nickel, manganese, cobalt, neither. So that could be really something also in the long run to reduce stress of the supply chain. And there were good recent, the technology developed quite well. So now I start to be a bit late, so I skip it. Just want to, for the last slide, show you a bit. Another thing is circular economy, which is very, very important to reduce carbon emissions for batteries. And circular economies is something that you have to do together. And you see we are at the moment in an InnoSwiss flagship project. 7 different groups working on circular economy and trying to make a lot of steps from building batteries, using the batteries, using Second Life to recycling batteries better and keep the materials in flow. And we do that together with 24 industry companies in Switzerland. So with that, I come to my end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian Ochsenbein, and please do take a seat as well. Well, let's dive into the discussion. You are very welcome to raise your hand if you do have a question. Not just yet. Give me about 10 minutes to get started. And then, obviously, the stage is also yours. I've got the cube again, like I said. And I do have an initial question for the 3 of you. And then is Roger Nordmann, is he still here? Ah! Can you stay here for just 2 more minutes, or is your train, yeah? No, okay, we'll do it first, then you can leave. Because there's, please, take a seat. There's this, or you can stand. We just talk to each other quickly. So there's this one question on the first panel I did not raise. I said, well, what you need is renewable technologies. And we were just sort of assuming, well, it's wind, it's solar. You talked a bit about hydrogen. What are really, because they said the mix of the renewables is going to affect the materials needed. So is it going to be wind, solar, maybe a bit of hydrogen, or what is it going to be?
Well, hydrogen is a energy carrier, basically. Mm-hmm. And it's not to compare with the huge advantage of hydrogen is mostly it's done out of water, so you don't have those huge material problem. But for the electrolyzer, at some extent, you have also material limits. It's just the fact that our civilization use a lot of material, and we have to increase in my opinion, the very promising way is the natrium battery was one of the critical elements for this, because we will need battery on the sodium or salt. You have a lot of.
Okay, so it's clear we need batteries. That's clear, but the mix of the renewables to make is it going to stay wind and solar and water?
Well, no, it will main is wind and solar. Yeah. Water stay, but our grandparents have used a lot of the usable water, so it will be wind and solar mostly. Maybe biomass is expensive because you have a lot of manipulation, and maybe geothermy at some extent, but it's also complicated and until now not very convincing, except for heating pumps. So it will be solar and wind.
That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you so much, and have a safe trip home.
Yes, thanks. Bye-bye.
Merci. So we keep that in mind, wind and solar and the effect maybe on the materials, but I do have another question for you to start with. We've heard this morning the world is still running on fossil to a large extent. We heard also we're going to need more energy because we are electrifying the world. There are going to be more people in Switzerland, at least that's the case. So is it actually that we are really transitioning, or are the renewables just adding to the fossil we have? What do you think?
If I can start, then you mentioned that we're electrifying more and more, which is true, and that does need more energy, but at the same time, electricity is the most efficient way to meet the end-use needs that we have. For example, if you think of heat pumps compared to gas boilers, they're so much more efficient. So moving to electricity doesn't necessarily mean, because end users already in Europe are mostly electrified, but then there's the rest of the world that's still catching up, so electricity demand will go up. And that means that as we electrify our end users, for example, cooking, heating, and so on, also in South Asia and in Africa, where the demand will rise significantly. And that's why we really need to ramp up the renewables there. So it's a bit of both. Of course, we still have fossil fuels. That's just the reality. But I think policy support has been really strong for renewables across the world. Really, even in China and India, that people think are relying a lot on coal, but those are also some of the regions in the world that have seen the most rapid deployment of solar and wind as well.
So you believe it's a real transition?
I do.
Okay. What about the two of you?
I think it's an important question, because if we're not substituting fossil fuel kilowatt hours with our renewable kilowatt hours, then we're not really improving. I think some of the latest research said it for every additional kilowatt hours, there was 40% renewable and 60% was still fossil. So we're improving, but not quite yet. And I think we could take this question to, maybe we could talk about vehicles and batteries and conventional, but yes, if we go far back in history, we've added, we still have biomass. Biomass was never a large share of our energy system, except in globally at least. And then we simply added some renewables, some non-renewables. And so, yes, when will we peak? At least in Switzerland, with nuclear has peaked. Fossil fuels have peaked. Energy, as we saw, electricity, sorry, as we saw, is not increasing. And so, yes, in some places we're clearly substituting. Globally, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. Christian?
Yeah, I hope, of course, for the first one that we fully decarbonize. And I think for most of the time, actually, this is possible, maybe with even less cost than what energy costs for now. But I think there are certain, well, it depends, of course, of global, which country you take and everything, but maybe something like 80 to 90% is actually quite easy to achieve, but the last percentage could be quite hard, right? So I think for quite some time we need to somehow keep up coal plants, gas plants, that when there is not a lot of wind, when there's maybe no sun like this morning, that we still can bring up the demand. But maybe we talked a lot about now photovoltaics, about wind, about batteries, but I think the fourth thing is intelligence. We need also to have intelligence and incentivize
intelligence,
people.
You mean manpower?
No, intelligence in the system, and also incentives for reducing, for example, the power consumption when there is low production. At the moment, for me at home, I don't know. I have a day and night price, and I don't care how I use my electricity. I saw lately a friend, he's living in Sweden, and he can see on his app the actual price, and is more on a liberal market. Before we hear liberal markets are not good, so I don't know, but he can He uses less energy when it's expensive, very simple, and I think
and
this
for
is
that
very
you need to be able to see it. There are some prosumer models where people could actually, I think in Wallenstadt that was the case, where they even were able to trade with their electricity, and they had tablets and they saw how it's changing, and because they saw it, because it became easier, less difficult to understand, they would start to save energy. You agree?
Yeah.
Okay, so I saw there's one hand up already. Let me ask one question before I get into the audience. We saw a list of a lot of different critical minerals. At the moment, batteries are lithium ion. You said, and also Rosa Nordmann said, the hope lies within the sodium battery. What do you think? Where is the development going? I mean, if we had sodium batteries, we'd have big problems solved, no?
So maybe first I can just talk a little bit about batteries and actually really the importance. Today, 90% of global batteries are being used in cars, especially lithium-ion batteries, and just 10% is being used for storage. But at the same time, as we're ramping up with solar PV and wind, we will need more and more batteries for storage as well, because if we want to expand our renewable capacity, we need to have somewhere to store that energy that we produce when there is a lot of sunshine, for example. So we also see this market for storage batteries rising rapidly as well. And I think sodium ion particularly can play an important role for these storage batteries.
Because they're big and they're still heavy and...
They are, so for the moment, from what I understand, the research is still more at the nascent phase, and clearly the market incumbent is lithium-ion batteries. And that's for several reasons. One is that sodium-ion batteries today still haven't reached the level of energy density that lithium-ion batteries have taken several years to achieve. So energy density, lower energy density basically means that there will be slightly larger batteries, and of course we will see improvements over the years as well. But this could clearly be a contender with lithium iron phosphate, which is used for storage currently. So lithium iron phosphate and sodium ion can really take up most of the energy storage market, and that will help bring down the demand for these critical minerals as well, as I showed in one of the slides. If we choose this sort of technology innovation, NMC batteries are extremely, they're high performance, they're high energy density, so they're really good for cars. But at the same time, when we have progress on the lower mineral intensity chemistries, then we can also start to sort of balance out the NMC batteries in transport as well. But for today, I think sodium-ion batteries are more suitable for energy storage, although there is a big push from China to deploy them in cars.
I think they brought out the first car, I think March 2023, that was run on sodium
1 year ago.
ion. Nevertheless, could it also have to do with the fact that the supply chains now are built for lithium and not so much for other types of batteries, that's going to be the predominant type?
Yeah, I mean, this is what I try to show with this map of the gigafactories, right? They are basically all on the lithium-ion technology, and I think that still will be for the next 5 to 10 years the main technology that we will see. And I think for this period there is also enough materials right now to build that batteries, and we see in Europe this new policy instrument, this new battery regulation, which is then for all European member states the same, which should lead to collect batteries, and even when you produce in the future new lithium-ion battery, a certain amount of some material has to come out of recycling. But what was interesting to see over the history, we saw first a hype in cobalt. So everybody say, oh, we need cobalt, so the price went up, and after 1-2 years collapsed because there were nickel-rich cathodes, and we no longer needed so much cobalt.
The children in the Congo will be thankful for that.
Huh?
The children in the Congo mines will be thankful for that.
Exactly. But then the same happens for nickel, And I think the same also happens for lithium. And the good thing is with the sodium-ion battery, depending how you build, that you can quite easily integrate them in the existing gigafactories, because it based a lot of roll-to-roll processes, and a lot of learnings that we built from lithium-ion batteries can somehow be transferred to sodium-ion batteries. So I'm not so afraid that we don't have enough materials for the next 10, 20 years.
Would you like to?
Yeah, I'm expecting these kinds of. It could be innovation. It could be just market substitution, cost playing in here. As long as we diversify, I think the pressure on materials will be lower. So I see it from it seems like a good idea to associate a specific function with a specific battery and make them different for storage, for mobility, and so on.
So it's almost a bit like with the renewables. I keep hearing from anyone out of the branch, they said it's about the mix. It's not just push one technology, but make sure we have the mix. Same for the batteries.
It's a whole portfolio, exactly. I think, and the great thing about batteries is that there's constant innovation to see what we can improve, what we can replace. And I think we had this great slide with the periodic table to show that things can be interchanged, and we're constantly finding out which mineral can be replaced and which one can be increased in favor of the other. For example, the cobalt example as well, which is how we changed the NMC chemistries from 333 to 811. So we've seen great innovation so far, and hoping that
and it keeps going.
Yeah.
But I think what this energy, this material mix leads, it's a material mix to less valuable material. It's going down, right? And this leads to a constant reduction of the battery prices, and with that, the technology becomes more and more competitive compared to gasoline-powered or fossil-powered technology. And I think this is the great news that we have today, that this has really the potential to go back to your initial question, to completely substitute the existing market.
Yeah. If it's affordable and fair for everyone to get, then it spreads. Okay, first question, gentleman with the mustache. Would you please, state your name and make sure you get close to the microphone.
Okay, Jonathan Green with the Geneva Energy Forum. I'd like to answer a little bit more to your question about the energy transition. Is it real? It depends how you look at it. If you look at it as a percentage...
Sorry, you have to hold the microphone really close,
right,
as if you were eating ice cream.
Okay. So if you look at it as... Is that okay? If you look at it as a percentage, there is a transition just about. Fossil fuels were probably 84% of the primary energy mix perhaps 10 years ago. Now it might be 81%, something like that. But if you look at it in real terms, this year we're set to produce probably or consume 103 to 104 million barrels of oil per day. That has steadily increased on an average over the last 30 years of about 2% per year, and it's not showing any sign of decline despite some people's enthusiasm to the contrary. So if you look at it simply as a percentage, it's declining, but if you look at it as total amount of oil consumed or gas or coal, it's still increasing, and it's increasing dramatically. So if your concern is CO2 production, we're in a really bad place. If your concern is simply the percentage of our energy mix, which is renewable, then we're going sort of in the right direction. To talk about the mineral side, one of the big problems we have with minerals is that they're not just in time supplied. You have to plan 10, 15 years out if you're going to have a new mine to produce a particular mineral or metal which becomes important at that time. In conversations I've had with the Australian Mining Association, I was asking them why they're not investing in renewable minerals, if you want to call them that, renewable metals, and they said it's because they don't have faith in the transition. They don't believe that it's going to happen in the way that everybody's hoping. So they're not opening new mines because they have the expectation that they'll be producing metal that no one wants to buy. So this is a problem like we had this morning, where you have to invest today in a future market. And as far as the miners are concerned, they don't think that market will be there, or it's not nearly as big or as predictable, because you're saying it's going to change with time?
So basically no hope for the transition to really happen. Would you like to comment on that? There was no question in it, or was there a question in it too?
Okay, do they think the transition will happen?
Well, that's what I just asked. They're hoping. Yeah.
Well, hope isn't good enough.
Hope isn't good enough. Anything to add?
I think you brought up an excellent point about the industry and, for example, the mining industry or any other industry, manufacturing, to have clear signals from policymakers. And this, as the IA, we've constantly been reiterating that the role of policymakers is really essential here, and that we need a clear roadmap of how they plan to achieve the net zero goals that so many countries have put out. We need to see clear milestones by year or by every 2 years that governments want to achieve. And once these are all in place for all the countries that have announced their net zero targets, then there will be the incentive for industry and for the mining sector or for the manufacturing of electrolyzers, of wind turbines and so on, to ramp up their production in such a way. And 100% agree that that signal is extremely important, and that could already be varying from like one geographical location to another. Maybe in Australia it's slightly different, but for example, there's positive signs in the EU. There's also positive signs in a region like Latin America, for example, which is already predominantly powered by hydropower, and a lot of their economy is based on the production of these minerals, particularly copper and lithium. So there you do see like scaling up of production of these minerals. Of course, Australia is a key player for lithium as well, but at the same time, they're also quite coal reliant. So I think there's a certain amount of lobbyism there as well.
But I hear it does take time, maybe more than we would love. We would love to see. Okay.
Okay. I had a question about biodiversity, use of water, use of land, because we talk a lot about CO2 and other greenhouse gases, but do you have an opinion to share about also the impact of all these minerals on biodiversity, use of land, and everything?
How dirty are they really? That's the question, right?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe, so as I said, I don't know any. Well, there's two things. Maybe what we can't get out of the ground, we have to grow it. There's other two options, and so there's no other way we can get materials, and I don't know of any clean. Where growing things can be clean, but extracting things from the subsoil is usually dirty, and it's perhaps Amrita showed one slide where we had the waste of mines. The fact that copper, for example, is extracted at 0.6, 0.5% concentration means the rest is waste, and out of the extracted materials, there's a chain of processes of cleaning, of concocting, and extracting, and that's rarely clean. There's a number of studies showing the impact of mines locally, regionally sometimes. Essentially tail ponds, breaking. So there's, the impacts are relatively high. Maybe the one exception could be lithium, especially from the Andes and Chile and Peru and Bolivia, Argentina as well, where it's essentially brines pumped out of the ground, 8 to 1,000 meters deep, and dried in big ponds. And it's also interesting because it's a co-product of other extracted materials, and just like cobalt is a co-product of copper, for example, and so on. So the impacts, well, they should be allocated but at least for something like lithium in the high and dry of the Andes, maybe the impacts are a bit lower than other metals.
So you say mining is dirty, period, but when we think about in which countries all those minerals are being extracted, are there more critical countries and less critical countries, or are policies in place for them to make sure the impact on the environment is as marginal as possible?
Yes, but that's probably why we're not opening mines in Europe. So, yeah.
Not in my backyard, huh?
And we're trying in Portugal and in the Rhine Basin for lithium, but yeah, it's something we don't want in our backyard, so.
But so, I don't know.
Yeah, but I of course agree with you, but when you look about the global mining, or not only mining industry, the global infrastructure also for oil and gas, also all the ships that you need to distribute the material, then the industry for the renewable energy is actually still much smaller, because we still have the materials at the end of the life of the product, right? So we can recycle, we can reuse, and we not just burn them. And I think this is something that is not a fair comparison.
It's not that bad anymore. Huh? Basically, you're saying once it's out, it's not that bad anymore.
I don't. Only if you recycle it well. This is very, very important, and that recycling means actually that you out of a old battery, you make a new battery. When you downcycle it, then the problem is not solved. Then you just continue in a way, and you use the material with a less grade. And I think this is something that we have to achieve. But what I want to say is to constantly burn a source, and it's gone to take it out and use it for a long time makes at the end a big difference. All the time.
Amrita, nevertheless, the question was, are there more or less critical countries? Are there policies in place that the damage is sort of minimized?
I think maybe quickly to just close up on what Christian said, I think it's extremely important to remember that often this conversation of is mining clean comes up for these minerals, and of course that's a very valid question, and answers need to be given and policies need to be put in place to make sure they're as clean as possible. But at the same time, oil drilling and coal mining is definitely not clean either. So at least along the way, once we are using these minerals, it's much better for the environment along the way downstream than it is to burn fossil fuels, that's for sure. And when it comes to your question about are there better regions or worse regions, unfortunately the regions are the ones where there are resources available. For mining, I think the world has become a lot more aware, as you mentioned, the case of DRC. And with this awareness, there have been many new policies and standards that have been put in place, particularly for social welfare of the workers, as well as for environmental aspects. It's not progressing as well as it should, but at least the efforts have been made and are hopefully continuing as well. But the important aspect is the processing and refining of these minerals, because that's the most energy intensive part and the most electricity intensive part, which currently today, as I showed, about 90% of most minerals are being processed and refined in China. And that's where, well, the electricity mix is not the best. It has slightly higher carbon footprint. And outside of, I think the only exception is nickel, that's mostly produced in Indonesia, where also we have the same problem with the electricity grid being mostly reliant on coal. So the processing and refining can really be decarbonized if we sort of diversify outside of these main regions, because even regions that have a lot of minerals, Africa, Latin America, and have a lot of renewables, they send all of their minerals to China for refining and processing.
So basically you're saying it'd be crucial to build up an infrastructure for
domestic
producing
infrastructure
and refining.
each,
domestic.
Exactly.
Okay. Next question, please.
Thank you. So, given the impact of mining, I believe you mentioned that we should try and recycle more. Now, I recently went to a conference in which they spoke of metals again. and the focus was on smartphones, for example. Someone said, we barely managed to recycle smartphones at all because basically they put at least half of the periodic table in it. And now you show the periodic table today, and I get a feeling that with batteries in general, we tend to have the same problem. So 2 questions. The first is, in theory, what percentage of the metals in a battery do you think we can recycle? And then second related question, in practice, what percentage can we actually recycle? Because each company has its own process. They make things more and more complicated. They hide things from each other. So those are the 2 questions.
Yeah, there are different ways of recycle batteries. Some are rather old. That's more like high temperature pyrometallurgic processes on which you have a certain loss of materials because it's high temperature. So some materials just are burned. But in the recent years, and now mainly the recycling industry that slowly builds in Europe, for example, is more on a low thermal processes, which have at the beginning first mechanical processes with shredding and particle separation, and after something what is called hydrometallurgy, so with leaching out different elements. And it's always the question of what you speak, but I would say from the valuable material there is 90% plus. It's quite easy to achieve. Even more now we start talking about electrolyte recycling and other materials too. I think it's not a question of can. I think the recycling, this is possible, but it's a question about the economics behind, right? It's, for example, LFP batteries have not a lot of valuable material, so it's not sustainable in the recycling itself. You need to incentivize it that you have a good recycling. So
same for sodium ion, yeah.
Yeah, that's even worse, right? Because 1 ton of lithium carbonate is, I don't know, roughly $40,000 and for sodium carbonate, like, I don't know, 300 or something like that. So a huge difference, yes. But you have to, with the new policy in Europe, you have to recycle the battery, right?
And you also have to share knowledge on how something is being constructed. You said we tend to hide data, tend to hide our concepts and how we do it, which makes it more difficult to recycle in the end.
Yes. But there is still room for innovation now, so there's research projects ongoing. And
in German, you would say Luft nach oben.
Exactly. Air for the brilliant minds that we have here in the audience to make it better, right?
Brilliant. That's almost. I'm checking the watch. We've got 3 minutes left. I know there's a gentleman who'd really like to ask a question, but also the lady up here. Go for it, and then we have to take a break.
Yes. Hello, my name is Lucille. I have a more geopolitical question. You've mentioned the situation of Europe and not in my backyard kind of attitude we have. How do you see this situation? Because I believe it's not the most comfortable one. As long as things are okay, maybe we can keep going, but until 2050 and even after, yeah, I'd like to hear a bit more about the position of Europe at the end of the production, actually only consumers line there.
Should I? So maybe I'll pick up what Mario Paolono said this morning. Maybe we need a pedagogical blackout every once in a while. Yeah, there's ways we can push for wind turbines, for more solar panels and so on. At some point, yeah, we'll have to come to a place where there's a way out, because there's no, yeah, if we keep our political commitments, then, yeah, it's as if we know, it's not as if we exactly know, we know if it's fair or not, how much oil and gas has to stay in the ground. So, and then we can take European countries, we know for Norway, we know for the UK, and so on. And so if we were to follow, for example, some of the recommendations of the IEA, exploration should stop. In Canada, for example, they have to leave 80% of their resources in ground. And so at some point, I feel like we'll reach the level where we know, okay, we can't keep running our same system, depending on the world, as much as Europe depends on the world. And we'll need to find solutions domestically.
But chances are that national interests will prevail.
Of course, and the market is set up for it. It's the highest payer gets the materials, gets the technologies, and so on. So we can go quite a way still.
Lots to be done. Last question, and then I am afraid we'll have to take a break. But we're going to have 15 minutes, and you'll be able to grab our guests and talk to them directly. I think you're still going to stay here for a bit. Last question, please.
Hello, this is Lazar. I have a question about the electrolyzers. So the demand from 2022 to 2023 has increased by 360%, and we know the electrolyzers are essential for hydrolysis of water and green hydrogen production. But how is this really implemented towards the large scale? And also in terms of efficiency, is that process efficient?
I didn't catch the last part of your question. How is this implemented?
On the large scale process, because we need hydrogen on large scale and not just in the lab, I mean.
Yeah, I think absolutely right. There's been a huge increase in electrolyzer capacity, but we have to remember that we're starting from a very low point, so it's not the same level as the deployment of solar PV that we had in 2023 or in 2022, and the growth from there that we saw was about 85% from 22 to 23. So electrolyzers are starting from a very low point. And I think it's important to remember I think hydrogen is not really the topic of this panel, but hydrogen has its pros and cons, at least for me personally. Not sure if it can solve all the issues. Like a few years ago, all governments were kind of hyping up hydrogen to be the solution for everything. I'm not sure that's the case, particularly for transport, especially for cars. Maybe for trucks it makes sense, but even then with LFP and sodium ion, I think that's the better option. Hydrogen definitely does make sense, for example, for maritime, for shipping and so on, because then we can convert it to ammonia, to synthetic fuels. But we have to be cautious about that as well, and how the hydrogen is being produced, because it should be produced in places where you have a lot of renewable energy. Otherwise, you're electrolyzing water with electricity that you made from coal. So,
and then we'd still have the topic about transportation, etc.,
Exactly.
etc. But as you said, definitely too much to discuss right here. Time's up. I would have loved to talk some more about recycling and maybe about being dependent on big countries. You mentioned Australia, but the mention was also China. Maybe you all can discuss it during the break. We're going to restart in approximately 12 minutes, so quick bio break, and we'll meet back here. Thank you so much for being here, Amrita, Vincent, and Christian. Merci. You may hand the thing.